there is a particular kind of grief that has no name. Not the grief of losing someone suddenly, not the grief of failure or disgrace, but the grief of spending an entire lifetime becoming something and arriving at it to find that the cost of becoming it was everything you actually wanted to keep. King Charles III is 77 years old. He carries a crown, a cancer diagnosis, an estranged son on another continent, and the long, unresolved shadow of a marriage the world spent decades judging him for. He has outlived the version of himself the public decided he was. He has survived institutions, scandals, and his own body. And by every credible account from people who know him closely, he is more at peace now than at any previous point in his life. That fact should comfort us. Instead, somehow, it breaks something open, because the question it raises is not a small one. What does it mean when a man finally finds himself only after he has lost almost everything that was supposed to matter? What does it mean when the peace arrives alongside the cancer, alongside the silence from a son who will not come home, alongside the knowledge that the crown he waited 7 decades for may have fewer years left in it than anyone is permitted to say aloud? To understand Charles at 77, you have to understand what 77 years inside this particular life actually cost. And that story begins not in a palace, but in a specific quality of silence that surrounds a child who has been taught before he is old enough to resist the lesson, that what he feels is less important than what he represents. The world has always had a version of Charles ready-made. For decades, that version was simple and unflattering: the cold husband, the unfaithful partner, the man who stood beside Diana Spencer while she was quietly drowning, too absorbed in his own emotional complications to reach for her. The tabloids constructed this version carefully, brick by brick, across the 1980s and 1990s, and the public accepted it because it was easy, and because Diana, radiant and wounded and impossible not to love, made the contrast feel obvious. But public verdicts are rarely the whole story, and in Charles's case, the verdict arrived before anyone had asked the more difficult question. Not what did he do to Diana, but what had been done to him long before Diana arrived. What kind of man had the institution already made by the time that marriage began? What was left of him genuinely to give? He was born in November of 1948 into a family that was also a corporation, a symbol, and a constitutional necessity. His mother was 22 and already being shaped by forces that would eventually make her one of the most disciplined public servants any democratic nation has ever produced. His father was 27, brilliant and restless, and carrying his own considerable damage quietly, as men of that generation were trained to do. From the very beginning, Charles existed in a household where love was real but rarely spoken, where presence was structured and scheduled, and where the institutional demands of being the House of Windsor consistently outranked the ordinary human demands of being a family. He was 8 years old when his father decided he should be sent to Gordonstown. 8 years old. There is something important about that age that tends to get lost in the broader biographical narrative. 8 is old enough to understand rejection, old enough to feel the specific message that being sent away communicates, even when no one intends it as a message. Old enough to lie awake in a cold dormitory in northeastern Scotland and understand with the particular clarity that children reserve for painful truths that you are somewhere you did not choose, because the people who chose for you decided this was what you needed. Gordonstown was Philip's school. It had formed him in the particular way that hardship forms certain men, by burning away softness and leaving something leaner and more enduring in its place. Philip believed in this. He was not being cruel. He was, by his own understanding of the world, giving his son the best possible preparation for a life that would demand endurance above almost everything else. What he could not account for was the fact that Charles was not Philip. Where Philip had hardened under pressure, Charles went inward. The bullying at Gordonstown was sustained and specific. His years, his accent, the unmockable target that royal blood paints on a boy who cannot respond the way ordinary boys can. He could not fight back with the casual brutality of the schoolyard. He was a prince, which made him both conspicuous and unable to be ordinary. That combination, in a school that worshipped toughness, made him a permanent outsider in his own education. What saved him was not resilience in the conventional sense. It was interiority. He discovered books. He discovered painting. He discovered music and theater and the rich private world that sensitive people build when the external world offers them no safe place to simply exist. He turned inward not from weakness, but from necessity. And what he built inside himself during those years, the capacity for reflection, for genuine curiosity, for sitting with complexity rather than demanding simple answers, would later make him seem eccentric to a public that expected kings to be straightforward. He was not eccentric, he was a person who had learned to live mostly in his own mind, because his own mind was the only territory no one else could occupy. He served, he studied. He became the first heir to the British throne to earn a university degree. He completed service in the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force. He performed every duty asked of him with a consistency that was, in its own way, remarkable, not dazzling, not charismatic in the way that generates headlines, but steady, present, showing up for the role even when the role gave nothing back. And then he waited. He waited while his mother reigned with a steadiness that seemed to exist outside of time. Elizabeth II was not simply long-lived. She was constitutionally immovable, a fixed point around which decades turned without disturbing her. Charles moved through his 30s, his 40s, his 50s, his 60s, building causes, writing letters that leaked, saying things about architecture that made him a punchline, advocating for environmental issues 2 decades before the culture caught up with him. He was perpetually slightly wrong for whichever era he was inhabiting. Too traditional for the reformers, too unconventional for the traditionalists, too sincere for a media environment that had learned to treat sincerity as either naivety or performance. He was 32 when he married Diana Spencer. She was 19. The numbers alone should give us pause. She was not a child, but she was not yet formed. She had not yet become the person she would become. She walked into a marriage with a man 13 years older. A man already shaped by decades of institutional pressure, already emotionally bonded at a depth no one discussed openly to someone else, already carrying the particular internal landscape of a person who had learned to manage feeling rather than express it. The marriage was not designed to make either of them happy. It was designed to produce heirs and satisfy the institution's requirement for a suitable match. By almost every measure of suitability the palace applied, Diana qualified. She was aristocratic, young, unmarried, photographable, and willing. What no assessment captured, because no assessment asked, was whether these two specific human beings could build a genuine life together. They could not. Charles's connection to Camilla Parker Bowles predated Diana by nearly a decade. It was not a casual attachment. It was the kind of bond that survives separation, other marriages, and institutional disapproval precisely because it is not based on convenience or arrangement. It was, by all evidence, the most genuine emotional relationship of his adult life. And the palace's solution to its inconvenience was not to address it. The solution was Diana. What followed is perhaps the most publicly dissected private failure of the 20th century. The marriage deteriorated across the 1980s in ways that both participants would eventually describe with remarkable candor, each from their own perspective, each telling a version of the truth that was real without being complete. Diana was lonely, neglected, and suffering in ways the palace was neither equipped nor inclined to address. Charles was emotionally absent in the particular way of a man who had never been taught to be emotionally present, who had been formed by an institution that treated vulnerability as a liability and duty as the appropriate substitute for intimacy. He was not a villain. He was not even, in the ordinary sense, a bad husband. He was something harder to name. He was a man who had been hollowed out by decades of performing a self rather than inhabiting one, who had given the most essential parts of himself to an institution and had very little left over for the people who needed him to simply be human. The separation came in 1992, the divorce in 1996, and then, on a Paris road in August of 1997, Diana died. She was 36 years old. The grief that followed was unlike anything Britain had witnessed in living memory. It was enormous and oceanic and not entirely about Diana, though the love for her was genuine. It was also a collective emotional verdict. The flowers outside Kensington Palace, the queues that stretched for miles, the weeping in the streets, these expressed something that had been accumulating for years. An institution had failed a woman the public had decided to love completely, and Charles, fairly or not, became the face of that failure. He did not defend himself. He arranged the funeral. He held his son's hands during the procession. He managed the impossible weeks afterward with a quietness that some read as coldness and others, closer to him understood as the only way he knew to function under unbearable weight. The public was not wrong to grieve. They were not wrong to be angry. But the verdict they reached, that Charles was simply cruel, simply cold, simply the man who had destroyed a fairy tale, was incomplete in ways that would take years to become visible. Then came the crown. Finally, after 73 years of preparation, of waiting, of performing readiness for a role that never arrived on schedule, Queen Elizabeth II died in September of 2022, and Charles, at 73, became king. He had less than 16 months before his body offered its own assessment of the timing. The cancer diagnosis came in early 2024, found almost by accident during treatment for a separate, more benign condition. The type was not disclosed. The stage was not disclosed. What was disclosed was that it was real, that treatment was beginning immediately, and that the king would step back from public duties while it was underway. And then, as though the universe were determined to demonstrate that grief does not arrive in polite increments, came the news about Kate, the Princess of Wales, his daughter-in-law, William's wife, the mother of his grandchildren. She too had cancer, diagnosed the same month, treated through the same spring. Father and daughter-in-law, the same season, the same invisible enemy. There are moments in a life that strip away every layer of identity that was built on top of the real person. Illness is one of them. You cannot be a king at 3 o'clock in the morning when the fear is loudest. You can only be a person, lying in the dark, wondering whether the body will cooperate with the plans the mind is still making. Charles met that darkness in the same way he has met every darkness in his life, without the language to fully name what he was feeling, but with the capacity to endure it. And in the cancer wards, in the communities of patients he began visiting after his own diagnosis became public, something shifted. He found, perhaps for the first time in his life, a space where his title was irrelevant and his humanity was all that mattered. He was not King Charles in those rooms. He was a man who knew what the treatment felt like, who knew what it cost, who understood the fear without needing it explained. He said, in his own words, that the compassion of strangers in a hospital is one of the things that holds you upright, that the darkest moments of illness can be illuminated by the greatest care. These are not the words of a man performing empathy. They are the words of a man who has been in the dark and found there something real. Harry remains in California. The meeting after the diagnosis was brief. The distance, for now, persists. This is perhaps the wound that does not close, because Charles, who was shaped by an institution that gave him everything except the emotional vocabulary to be a present father, almost certainly did not know in the moment his son was pulling away what was actually being asked of him. And by the time he understood, the gap had become something that cannot be crossed by intention alone. Andrew remains a separate kind of damage, an institutional wound that Charles inherited along with the crown, with no clean resolution available, only management and distance and the ongoing work of protecting something larger than any one member of the family. And yet, in the midst of all of this, the credible accounts say the same thing. He is more himself now than he has ever been. The illness clarified something. The crown, finally worn rather than only anticipated, gave the waiting its meaning. Camilla, the relationship the world spent decades refusing to accept, turned out to be the one constant that held. She is beside him in the ways that matter, not as a symbol, as a person who stayed. What does it mean to spend 7 decades becoming someone and only become yourself at the end of it? What does it mean to lose a marriage publicly, a son privately, your health quietly, and arrive at 77, carrying all of it, still reading the red boxes every night, still showing up for the audiences and the visits and the duties that never pause for human complication? It means, perhaps, that the preparation was never really for the crown. The preparation was for this, for the specific burden of remaining present when everything in you wants to retreat, for the particular discipline of continuing to show up when the body is tired and the family is fractured and the public is still forming opinions based on a version of you they decided on 30 years ago. Charles has been many things the world found easy to dismiss. Eccentric, anachronistic, too sensitive for an institution that punishes sensitivity, too earnest for a culture that rewards performance. But at 77, sitting in cancer wards and reading boxes and carrying a crown that arrived late and a diagnosis that arrived immediately after, he is something the world is only beginning to recognize. He is still here, Not because the institution required it, because he decided somewhere in the long years between the cold dormitories of Scotland and the hospital corridors of London that showing up is the only honest answer to a life that asks more than any one person should reasonably be asked to give. The tragedy of King Charles is real. The cost has been real. The loneliness was real. The fractures are real. But so is this. A man who was never given the tools to be fully human, finding at the end of a very long road something that actually resembles peace, whether that peace can survive what is still coming, whether the family can be repaired, whether the institution he now leads can outlast the centuries' impatience with inherited authority. None of that is certain. What is certain is that he has carried more than most people will ever be asked to carry, and he has not put it down. Do you think it is possible to finally become yourself only after you have lost every version of yourself that others created for you? If this story stayed with you, subscribe, because every week we go beyond the headlines to find the human being underneath.